Okay, let's dive right into this explainer and crack open one of the most widely misunderstood economic shifts of the last 3 decades. We're going to look really closely at a phenomenal piece of research that digs deep into the UK economy to uncover exactly why the gap between top earners and bottom earners has grown so massively. And honestly, this isn't just about boring numbers on a spreadsheet. It's about the fundamental structure of how we work and how value is actually created in the modern world.
So we're going to treat this a bit like a detective story. Our main mystery? We need to find out why wages at the 90th percentile have absolutely skyrocketed compared to those down at the 10th percentile. Over the span of just a few decades, we've seen this gap widen dramatically. But here's the thing, the mainstream explanations often fall completely short of capturing the full picture. Why? Well, mostly because they're looking in the wrong places entirely, or just looking at the wrong type of data.
All right, we have to start by busting a massive myth right out of the gate. The media absolutely loves to blame the pay gap on a fat cat CEO versus a frontline worker at the exact same company. I mean, it makes for a great punchy headline, right? But the data actually proves something entirely different. When researchers analyzed an enormous panel of UK businesses, we're talking about tracking over 11,000 firms and 13 million workers every single year, they found that macro-level inequality is actually driven by the gap between totally different companies rather than the gap inside the same company.
Which brings us to our first major clue, within versus between firms and the true inequality gap.
Looking at that UK panel data from 1984 to 1999, researchers found that individual wage variation increased by about 16 log points overall. Simply put, that means the percentage gap between the top and the bottom was stretching out incredibly fast. This is a highly significant jump, guys. If you look at the workforce as a whole, the spread between the absolute highest and lowest earners was widening at a totally astonishing rate.
Now here is where it gets really fascinating. Almost all of that aggregate wage inequality growth is a between-firm phenomenon, not a within-firm one. When they broke down that 16 log point increase, the gap inside individual companies, it remained relatively flat. Almost the entire chunk of that massive growth in inequality came from the widening chasm between the average pay of different companies operating in the exact same industries.
So, the absolutely crucial takeaway here is that inequality is rising primarily because the gap in pay between different companies in the exact same industry is just blowing up. Two people with the exact same skills, doing the exact same job in the exact same sector, can have wildly different wages. And it really all comes down to the specific name on the front of the building they walk into every morning. It literally is about where you work, not just what you do.
So where exactly is this happening? Let's check out the service sector surge, because this is where the real action is.
This brilliantly illustrates why older studies completely miss the mark. If you look at the data for traditional manufacturing, the wage percentiles are fanning out a little bit, sure, but they stay relatively compressed. But then, look over at the private services sector. That top tier, the 90th percentile, spikes dramatically. It shoots up by roughly 40 log points, which is a massive, unchecked upward spike, while the bottom tier barely even twitches. Earlier studies totally missed this because they were hyper-focused on the flat manufacturing sector, totally ignoring the highly dynamic private services sector where all the action was taking place.
And this leads us straight to our prime suspect, the productivity gap. In short, output drives wages.
We've got our smoking gun right here. When you measure firm-specific labor productivity, basically the value added per worker, between 1984 and 2001, productivity absolutely skyrocketed by 60 log points at the 90th percentile. Those top-tier companies were figuring out how to generate vastly more value per single employee. Meanwhile, the firms down at the 10th percentile, they barely crept up by 20 log points. So the productivity distribution moved in almost perfect lockstep with the wage distribution.
You know what's wild? You can actually see how this gap behaves dynamically. During the early 90s recession, the productivity dispersion temporarily shrank. Why would that happen? Well, it's because of what economists call the cleaning effect of recessions. The absolute least productive firms at the very bottom just went bankrupt and completely exited the market. When you cut the weakest links, the bottom of the dataset simply vanishes, which temporarily shrinks the gap right before the top firms start sprinting ahead all over again.
But hold on, before we lock in our final answer, we need to eliminate the false suspects and narrow down the culprits.
The researchers vigorously stress-tested the data and ruled out 3 major excuses. First, they looked at capital intensity. Thinking maybe the top firms just bought a lot more basic equipment. Nope, that didn't explain the gap. Next up, transitory shocks. Maybe the market just got more volatile?
But by tracking how often companies swapped places at the top, they found that firms at the highest levels consistently stayed there. It wasn't a fluke. Finally, they looked at the entry and exit of new startups. While new businesses are definitely more dispersed in productivity, the gap was widening significantly even among established, surviving companies. So we can safely say none of these are our main culprit.
With the false suspects totally cleared out, we are left with the technology factor. It all comes down to adapting to the future.
The data strongly shows that the rise in labor productivity inequality perfectly mirrors the rise in what economists call total factor productivity, or TFP. Now, TFP isn't just about throwing more workers or more basic machines at a problem. It's the technological secret sauce. It represents how brilliantly a company combines its inputs to create output. And this widening gap in TFP points directly to how differently firms are adopting new technology.
To quote the underlying theory from economist Francesco Caselli, when a general-purpose technology like information and communication technology becomes available, firms adopt technologies at different rates and be successful to different degrees. Think of companies running a massive marathon. The introduction of ICT was literally like handing out a brand new pair of ultra-high-tech spring-loaded running shoes. The firms that grabbed them fast and figured out how to run in them sprinted massively ahead. The firms stuck in their old clunky shoes, or the ones who bought the shoes but had no idea how to tie the laces, well, they fell massively behind.
Backing this up, when the researchers looked at industry-level data, they found that the share of ICT capital jumped from just 3.4% of all capital services in the mid-80s to a whopping 15% by the late 90s. And here is the real kicker. The specific industries with the fastest ICT growth perfectly match the ones with the largest productivity gaps. So technology isn't just some helpful tool, it's an economic wedge that is literally driving the modern economy apart into top-tier winners and bottom-tier laggards.
So, to wrap up this explainer, I really want you to take a second and look around your own workplace. We've seen today that modern inequality isn't primarily about the CEO down the hall making more than you, it's actually about the company across the street figuring out the future faster than your company is. The productivity and wage gaps are fundamentally driven by technological adoption, so you have to ask yourself, which side of the productivity divide is your firm standing on? Are you working for a high-tech sprinter or a firm falling behind in the marathon? Honestly, it might just be the most important question you can ask for your own economic future.